Lesson 3 describes the service transition process called change management, and this process has 9 objectives. First, we'll understand the main goals, objectives, and scope of change management. Next, we'll learn key change management terms and concepts, including the 3 types of changes. We'll also learn about the role of the change manager, as well as the change authority and the change advisory board. Next, we'll become familiar with a technique for evaluating changes called the 7 R's of change management, and we'll learn the importance of the remediation plan. We'll finish up this lesson with an overview of the change management process activities and how they interrelate with other service transition processes. Change management is one of those processes that is constantly happening. Even though it's introduced here in service transition, it provides advice and guidance to all phases of the life cycle. The main goal of change management is to allow IT to be responsive to the business when they change their business needs. And when we make those changes to our IT services to be reactive, we do it while reducing disruption and rework. A robust change management process ensures that we have standardized, repeatable methods and procedures to promptly handle our IT changes. And it also ensures that anytime we make a change, that the details of exactly what changed get updated in the configuration management system or the configuration management database. Change management also helps ensure that overall business risk is minimized by being an agile partner to the business. The main objective of change management is to ensure that changes are recorded and then evaluated, authorized, prioritized, planned, tested, implemented, documented, and reviewed in a controlled manner. Take a look at that sentence because I want to show you a trick. If you really read that sentence, it tells you that change management is mostly a paper-pushing process. It ensures that changes are recorded and then evaluated, authorized, prioritized, planned, and tested, and yada, yada, yada. But if you read the subtext, change management doesn't actually do the changing. They ensure that the change was done and done right, but they don't actually get their hands dirty. Now, what you don't know yet is that there's a process called release and deployment management, and that's the process that actually does the heavy lifting. Release and deployment management does the techie stuff, like building, testing, implementing, installing, documenting, training. Change management is just standing there with a clipboard, ensuring that release and deployment management got it done, and they got it done right. So think of change management as the process that manages and coordinates changes. And those are kind of fluffy, paper-pushy words. Release and deployment management is where the action's happening, and that's the process that uses the action words. Now, this sounds like I'm beating on people who work in change management, and that's not the case, because change management does not have an easy job. They are accountable for the overall success of all changes. So it's up to them to be sticklers, because if a change fails, it's their neck that's on the line because they're the one who authorized it. The change management process introduces some new vocabulary, so let's have a look. First, we have the word change, which means exactly what you think it does. It's an alteration of some kind. Applied to ITIL, we can say that it's the addition, modification, or removal of approved CIs. They make the of approved CIs distinction because it only has to go through change management if the thing you're changing is something that you're calling a CI. In the service asset and configuration management process, we had an activity there called identification, which is where we figured out what we were going to track as CIs. If your company decides not to track keyboards and mice as CIs, then you could change keyboards and mice all day without having to even think about the change management process. You need to remember this golden rule, and no matter what happens, this rule will always apply. You can never, ever, ever make any change to a CI without going through change management and getting permission first. Now you might be thinking, wait, what? If I'm a desktop technician and I need to install Adobe Acrobat on somebody's machine, you're telling me I have to go through the change management process? Yep. But wait a minute, I'm a server tech. You're saying that if I need to delete some old logs off a server, which I guess is a change, then I have to go through change management? Yep. But that's a huge hassle. It sounds like I'm going to spend the rest of my life in change management meetings. Well, not necessarily, but you're on the right track. So for now, just remember that rule, as painful as it sounds, that you can never, ever, ever make any change to a CI without going through change management and getting permission first. Our next term is an RFC, or request for change. This is the form that gets filled out and submitted by the person who wants to have something changed. These forms can be paper-based or electronic. The request for change form is simply the mechanism that gets somebody's change into the change management process. We also have the term PIR, or Post-Implementation Review, and sometimes this is also called a change review. It's a quick meeting after a change has been installed into production just to see how it went. What went right? What went wrong? Did we stick to our budget? Did it take as long as we thought it would? Did we get everything done? These are the types of questions that we're going to ask after every change in our PIR, or Post-Implementation Review. Now, the next two terms on this slide go together, but let's start with the first one. The CAB, or the Change Advisory Board, is a dynamic group of people who help the change manager assess and authorize larger scale changes. It has technical personnel representing all areas of IT in attendance, and sometimes people from the business side will attend too. The CAB helps assess, prioritize, and schedule changes. Depending on what changes we have on the change management meeting agenda for that week, will determine who gets invited to that week's change management meeting. If the only change we have on the agenda for discussion this week is a simple change to the mileage reimbursement rate in the payroll application, do we have to invite the head of networking to that meeting? Nah, don't waste their time. But you should invite somebody from application management, somebody from the server team, and you might want to have some representatives from human resources and payroll as well. It's pretty typical for companies to have change management meetings once or twice per week, but your mileage may vary. Sometimes we also have true emergency changes for things like urgent security patches to fix a vulnerability, or taking a server down to replace a piece of failed hardware, or switching to your failover site because of a water leak in the data center. For these types of true emergencies that cannot wait for the next scheduled change management meeting, the ECAB, or the Emergency Change Advisory Board, is assembled on the fly to provide the necessary authorization right there. An ECAB meeting can be a super quick hallway meeting, or it can be a conference call. But don't forget, you can't ever make any changes to a CI without getting this permission first, even if it's at 3 a.m. It's never okay to do the work first and ask permission later, ever. But if you have an easily accessible ECAB, then this shouldn't pose a problem. These terms will definitely show up on an exam, so make sure that you're familiar with them. Changes come in 3 flavors: normal, standard, and emergency. What constitutes normal has to be defined by your own organization, but for our purposes here, we can just say that normal changes must go through all the steps of the change management process and must be added to the change management meeting agenda and brought before the change advisory board. We'll talk about those change management process steps in a few slides. Our second type of change, or emergency change, needs to be introduced as soon as possible. Your organization should have a procedure for handling true emergencies. Depending on the nature of the emergency, it can be authorized by the change manager with input from the smaller and more easily accessible ECAB, or if the change manager isn't available, then the ECAB itself can make the authorization. It might be very tempting to try to push as many things through the emergency change process as possible, because on the surface it looks like it's a lot more streamlined and there's a lot less paperwork. But that's not always true, because the paperwork you may save on the front end, you'll probably wind up doubling on the back end. Now remember during that last slide when I said that you can never change anything without going through the change management process, and you were thinking, that's crazy, I'll never be able to do my job since I'll be drowning in change management stuff. Well, here's your out. We have a third type of change called a standard change, which is a pre-authorized change that has an accepted, established procedure. It's usually low cost, low risk, and something your team is pretty good at. Your organization needs to compile a list of standard changes, and only the items on this list are changes that your IT teams are allowed to make without asking for permission every time. So we asked for permission once. And once that change has been officially deemed a standard change and it's on the standard change list, permission is now granted for that specific change for all time. So this standard change construct allows the golden rule of you can never change anything without going through change management and getting permission first to coexist peacefully with IT people whose jobs consist of making a zillion changes per day. For the exam, you'll need to know these 3 types of changes, and you'll need to remember that standard changes are pre-authorized. One other little test-taking pitfall I want to warn you about is the word normal and the word standard can almost be used interchangeably, but not here in ITIL. Normal changes are changes that have to go through the usual change management process. Standard changes are those pre-authorized ones. Now, you've probably picked up by now that I usually like to end lessons with a roll slide, but this lesson's a little bit different because the change manager could very well be a full-time position and they have a lot of day-to-day duties that we need to talk about to get through the rest of the lesson. In addition to being the process owner and having the DEMI duties that go along with it, your change manager also has other operational duties to take care of. They have to monitor process adherence, which is a big job considering so many people are trying to find sneaky ways around the change management process. They also make the change management meeting agendas. They send out the meeting invites so the right people attend the meeting according to what changes are being evaluated that day. And they chair the change advisory board meetings. And they coordinate the building, testing, and implementation of the change. And notice here again that they're only coordinating these action words, because it's up to release and deployment management to actually do the change. Once the change is complete, they hold a post-implementation review session. As part of the D in DEMI, where they document the change management process, the change manager also has to determine and then document what constitutes a normal, standard, and emergency change. And then the change manager is the single person who holds the authorization stamp because they are the accountable person for the success of all changes. So the change advisory board advises the change manager to authorize the change or not. But the change manager makes the final decision. So to clarify a bit, in order for a change to get authorized, does this mean that the change manager has to know every single thing about every application, server, network segment, service, contract, customer, and vendor? No, of course not. But this is why the change manager has to invite the right people and the smart people to sit on the CAB that week. The CAB is the group that decides whether or not they think the change should be permitted, but it's the change manager who has to be convinced. Mommy, where do changes come from? Well, changes can come from many different places. They can come from IT people. Maybe a network administrator submits a request for change to change a router configuration. Or a user might call the service desk to ask to have their old monitors swapped out for a flat panel. Or there may be some kind of project initiation document where the finance department might be implementing a new payroll system. Or you may have a huge document called a change proposal for really big changes. Like if you're outsourcing your whole service desk or moving your base of operations to Fiji, you're not going to write that on a dinky little request for change form, so you'll have to write some big document called a change proposal for that. Changes can come from many directions, but these types of changes are all technical in nature. The thing to remember is that changes to business processes don't go through our IT department's change management process. Of course, if the business changes their business processes, it's possible and probable that the fallout of that might require some IT changes to happen down the line. But we here in IT shouldn't ever hear about the business changing some business process because it doesn't affect us. So who really authorizes changes? I've been saying it's the change manager, and that's still true because they are the single person who holds the authorization stamp. But depending on the size and scope of the change, you may have to get different levels of input. Do you have a little standard change? Well, then that can be authorized here locally. But the larger the change, the more people you'll have to get involved with a higher or larger change authority. Before a change is authorized, we need to ask a bunch of questions to make sure it's a good idea. We can use this trick called the 7 R's of change management to evaluate the change. We ask questions like, who raised the change? What's the reason for the change? What are the risks involved? Who's responsible for the build, test, and implementation? What's the relationship between this change and other changes? Remember that we do this exercise while we're evaluating the proposed change. Some people get confused and they think that this happens after the change to see if it went well, but they're just confusing this with the PIR, the post-implementation review. These 7 R's happen before and the PIR happens after or post. Now, the good news here is that students aren't expected to memorize this list of 7 R's, but you are expected to know that we ask these 7 R's questions to help evaluate whether a change should be authorized or not. Speaking of change authorization, we should never authorize a change unless we are confident in the back-out plan. The change manager should always check to make sure that a remediation plan exists and that it's been tested. I've seen requests for change documents that have undo written as their backout or remediation plan. No. The backout plan needs to be thorough and it needs to be tested. Now, if you're a techie, you can probably think of a few flavors of changes that once you start them, there is no backing out. And that's all well and good, but you still have to have an explicit, tested plan for what you'll do in the event that the change fails midstream. Finally, here is a diagram of the change management process flow. We start off with a request for change, also known as an RFC, and these can come from anywhere: users, IT people, external vendors, any place. The submitter creates the RFC, and that RFC gets recorded in the CMS. You'll probably have some kind of change management data repository of some kind, like a spreadsheet, a SharePoint site, or it might even be part of your service desk tool. But since there is no official ITIL-titled thing called the Change Management Database, we'll just say that it's stored generically in the CMS. The request for change reaches the change manager's desk, who then assigns it a unique number in the CMS, and then eyeballs it to make sure that it's a worthy change. Is the form filled out correctly? Does it have all the right information? If not, filter it out. Or is it just a silly change, like somebody wants a new building built because the view is better? Filter it out. But if it's so far so good, then we assess the change. Here we do some risk analysis, which lets us assign a risk category. We do the 7 R's, and we check to see if the proposed implementation date is a good day to do this, and we check to make sure that the backup plan looks good. If so, the change manager asks the change advisory board what they think, and the change advisory board says yay or nay. The change manager considers their advice and then either authorizes or rejects the change. Now don't forget, the CAB, also known as the Change Advisory Board, they don't actually authorize changes. They just advise the change manager what they think is best. Now, assuming that this change was authorized, the change manager then coordinates the change implementation. But you'll see that release and deployment management actually does the actual implementation of the change. The word coordinate is a fluffy paper-pushing word, so that's change management. But implements the change? That's heavy lifting, so that's release and deployment management. Now, once it's been implemented, we come back to change management and do the post-implementation review, and then we close the change record, assuming that all went well. Now, this slide shows us that change management doesn't work in a vacuum. There's service asset and configuration management, keeping the CMS up to date every time a change changes its status. And then we have release and deployment management over here doing their implementation stuff. Now, what does this implementation oval entail? Well, let's move on to lesson 4 to find out.